I'm now really pleased to have here as our speaker for today, Veronika Koller. I don't think she needs much of an introduction. She's a professor of discourse studies at the University of Lancaster and has worked in many fields, from metaphor in cancer patients to business communication and business study, business communication and discourses of business. And she's today going to talk about analyzing emotion in social media comments. Veronika, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Michael, and many thanks for the invitation. So I'm going to present some of my current research, and I will start by sharing my slides. We did have some tech issues just before we started, so hopefully, we will get through it all right. We do have a plan B, but hopefully we'll get through it all right. So sharing slides, here we go. Okay, there we are. Okay, so you should be able to see the slides now, hopefully. Yeah, all good? Yeah. Good, excellent. Okay, so as I said, some of my current research, analyzing emotion and social media comments. As an outline, I will start with towards, really. I've called it towards, so attempting a definition of emotion. This is very current research, and it may change, but this is what it is at the moment. I'll then talk a bit about concepts that have been developed theoretically about emotions and social media discourse. So not necessarily individual studies of it, but more looking at relevant theories. I will then present a taxonomy for analyzing emotions in social media comments and beyond. I did say that I would bring examples from 3 different studies. When I realized it's only half an hour, and I thought, okay, I've got to cut back a bit. So I've brought examples which are comments, online social media comments on posts by populist parties. So some recent research and some current research. And I'll finish with some outlook and also some questions that are still very much open for me. Before I start, I want to give due credit. So one is to my colleague Laura Filar-Llamas. She and I are part of a research team about voices of supporters of populist parties. As a team, we published a book about 2 years ago, and we are currently working on the follow-on project in a slightly rejigged team. And some of the data and analysis that I'm going to present later is things that I have done with Laura. And the other credit I want to give is to Ningyuan Wang, who I believe is in the audience. We're currently working on emotion in videos and comments, social media comments on these videos. And the affect taxonomy that I'm going to present is something that we have developed together. Good, so let's see, towards the definition of emotion. One school says that emotion is not only the property of the individual, so the experience, but also sees emotions as inter-individual dynamic constructs. So something that is relational and something that is constructed in interaction, not least discursive interaction, obviously. That brings us to the notion by Margaret Wetherell, a very important paper in this area of emotional discourse, who introduced, I believe, the notion of affective practices, which she says are patent emotional activity, but they're also situated and they are historical. And for her, affective practices do include bodily sensations, but crucially language and discourse, also power relations. She very much comes from a critical angle, and social norms and expectations. So this gives us a first idea of the link between evaluation and emotion, which will be important in the analysis I present. So social norms and expectations have to do with values. And when we have values, we are obviously also engaging in assessing people, behaviors, objects, ideas against those norms and values, and evaluate them against those norms. So the idea of a link between evaluation and emotion is not new at all. So in Western philosophy, it goes right back to the 17th century, and that's only in Western philosophy. So it's worth looking at Descartes here, so going right back, who in I believe his last work, The Passion of the Soul, talked about, at least implicitly, about this link between emotion and evaluation. So he said, when we think of something or an action as good with regard to us, so as beneficial for us, this makes us love it. And when we think of it as bad or harmful for us, this can arouse hatred. Later he also says anger in us. So emotion is, in this thinking, an effect of how we assess and evaluate certain things or behaviors. He then links that to desire. So if we think something will be good for us, we desire it for the future, or when we have it in the present, it makes us feel joy. On the flip side, if we think something would be harmful for us, it may be some sort of aversion, or if it's present at current, it can lead to sadness. And he then links that to future-related emotions such as hope or anxiety as well. Certain things are in red here because they are particularly central emotions for the social media data that I'm going to present. So for comments on the posts of populist parties. Descartes also has things to say about wonder, so that can lead to esteem or pride or contempt and scorn. And contempt, scorn, derision, that is something that I will come back to as well. So I'm noting that here. Back to the present day, Descartes has been influential for current theories of affect and discourse. So one recent theoretical paper is by Sophia Lampropoulou and others who look at narratives and affective stance. I'm not going to look so much at narrative, but I think their theoretical considerations are important for what I'm doing. They also see affect as a discursive practice, so very much influenced by Wetherell here. And for them, this practice involves articulations and recruitments of affect. And again, they do say that affect is embodied and that it can be recruited to make meaning in situated activities. They also say it's a mode of performance, and crucially, they say it's an act of stance taking. So again, developing a stance, also again, I see that as an effect of assessing things against the norm, evaluating them, and based on that evaluation, taking a stance, an emotional stance. Important thinker who was influenced, among many others, by Descartes is Sarah Ahmed, who introduced the notion of affective economies, which for her are processes where feelings are produced as effects of circulation, including discursive circulation, so that we know what to legitimately feel in reaction to something because of our previous knowledge of what we should feel. I'm simplifying, of course. That's an important theory which ties in with discursive practice and affective practice. It's perhaps for me a bit too discourse idealist, a bit too much of there is no affect outside of discourse. The other theorists I've quoted here all allow for the embodied and physiological nature of emotion as well. And I don't see the two as being mutually exclusive. So taking all that into consideration, here's a working definition as I would propose it now. So to say that emotions are mental, affective, and physiological states and processes. They manifest in discourse, but they are also influenced by discourse. So it's a mutual relationship. Emotions in this definition are both individual and collective, and they follow the basis of affective practices. An important caveat here is that discourse analysis alone does not tell us what emotions are experienced by people. We don't know what discourse producers actually feel, what recipients, the audience of a discourse, experiences emotionally, nor do we know through discourse analysis alone what emotional experiences social actors who are represented in discourse undergo. What we can do with discourse analysis is we can describe what emotions are represented in a given discourse and also what emotions are afforded. I'll come back to that. We can describe how that is done. And by drawing on context, we can interpret why certain emotions are represented and afforded and why in a particular way. So it's important to know what we can and cannot do. Now, homing in on emotions in social media discourse, as I said, these are still fairly high-level theoretical considerations and influences. So Milani said that the affective dimension has not been fully appreciated by including critical discourse analysts. And he notes that the critical discourse studies for a long time have relied on theoretical assumptions that have favored rationality at the expense of emotions, something where I wholeheartedly agree with Milani, not least in argumentation analysis, not least in the discourse historical approach, but in other approaches within critical discourse studies as well. Kowalewski has something similar to say. He says at one point that in the quoted study here, or quoted paper, that critical discourse studies at the moment under-theorize affect and emotion. And for him, that is a gap that needs to be filled because of two things, because of the rise of social media discourse and within political discourse, the rise of populism. He says that the rise of populism is rooted even in relatability over rationality, and in political communication, including in social media, that translates, according to Kowalewski, in a triumph of affect over argumentation. And social media in particular, for him, are the epitome of preferring affective relevance over relational significance. So populism and social media for him come together to challenge the primacy of rationality. A primacy that has certainly been there in critical discourse studies, but that more broadly he also sees, Kowalewski that is, sees at a social level, social context, where he said what we have witnessed for a long time is the triumph of neoliberal rationality. And he sees populist politics as a reaction against these neoliberal rationality and its primacy. And populism is here fueled and reinforced by affordances of social media, all of which lead to a dominance of affect over rationality. And both he and Milani say that critical discourse studies have some catching up to do in terms of theory development and analysis and operationalization of emotion and discourse. There's two concepts that I believe are important when we look at emotions in social media discourse. One is Papacharissi's notion of the affective public. So the idea that the online public sphere is radically different from the public sphere as pronounced by Habermas, but it is one that is shaped by affect. She says that emotions circulate on social media, for instance, through hashtags, but not only, and that these emotions motivate people to relate to each other online, but that these so-called affective publics are collectives that are very temporary and also very fluid. She also notes that social media affordances, so technological affordances, foreground emotion, making it easier for these affective publics to form. And in political terms, she says that an expression of emotion on social media can lead to offline political actions. Studies have been done on phenomena like the Arab Spring, for instance, but they can also lead to polarization. And there's a lot more empirical research on that as well. The second concept I'd like to mention is ambient affiliation, first formulated by Szczepaniak in 15 years ago, really. So she started with work on hashtags, which make online discourse searchable. So her book is famously called Searchable Talk. So, and because it's searchable, people can have this ambient affiliation around hashtags, where lots of people use it for a while, although they may not interact directly, they just share these hashtags and are part of that affiliation around hashtags. People may not even know each other, and they may never interact again outside of this, again, rather fleeting and temporary situated affiliation. More recently, Szczepaniak and others have worked on emojis, and a recent study about emojis and language in social media comments on TikTok videos, for instance. Szczepaniak and Logi show how together emojis and language can create emerging prosodies, a term borrowed from corpus analysis, negative or positive prosodies. So how there can be an ambient affiliation through emojis and language together. And again, here we're talking about evaluation. So these ambient affiliations through emojis and language develop because of evaluation. Szczepaniak is also influenced by earlier work on online humor and observes a coupling of interpersonal and ideational meanings to terms from systemic functional linguistics. And saying, for instance, the evaluation is an interpersonal strategy. The evaluation here would include emotion. So if evaluation as an interpersonal strategy goes together, as it invariably does, with the target of the evaluation, we have a combination of interpersonal and ideational meaning. And people, again, affiliate around that. Good, so this is all fairly high level in terms of theory on emotions in discourse, on emotions in social media discourse. Let's look at how some of these concepts can be operationalized for an actual study of emotion in social media. Just to be clear, when I say analyzing emotion in social media comments, I am not talking about sentiment analysis. There's a lot of it. So automated extraction of so-called sentiment, which I do, as a discourse analyst, have reservations about. I think it is a tool that is very popular in political science, in marketing, because the premise is that it helps to identify what's known as tone at a very large scale. But tone is basically positive, negative, or neutral evaluation. So from a discourse analytical point of view, I find it a rather crude element, really, or crude tool. So that's not what I'm talking about here. I'm talking about a discourse analytical approach. And I'm, like Szczepaniak, I'm drawing here on appraisal theory as first formulated by Martin and White. So I'm sure that many of you are very familiar with that. Appraisal theory distinguishes between attitude, engagement, or intertextuality, and graduation. So if something is reinforced or lowered down, mitigated, intensified, made more precise, more vague. I'm interested for my purposes here in the attitude subsystem, which in itself comprises of judgment, appreciation, and affect. So judgment is typically an evaluation of people and their behavior, whereas appreciation is typically an evaluation of objects, ideas. Now, the idea here is that, as Benítez, Castro, and Hidalgo, Tenorio have said, we can group together judgment and appreciation as a sort, and they call it opinion. Those are evaluations along ethical lines with judgment, people and their behavior, and evaluation is along aesthetic lines of things, appreciation. And we can see that, this kind of evaluation, as the cause of emotion. So again, this takes us right back to Descartes and thinking in that sort of intellectual heritage. So evaluation as the cause of emotion, emotion as the effect of evaluation. When it comes to affect, Martin and White distinguish between realis and irrealis, so affect towards actually existing things and towards things that may or may not exist. Martin and White formulate four top-level categories, both with negative and positive polarity. so happiness or lack thereof, insecurity or insecurity, satisfaction and dissatisfaction. And then when it's about possibly existing objects, for want of a better word, inclination or disinclination. And they give some examples of what might fall under that. I have to say, when dealing with actual data, this is still fairly coarse-grained, really. So what I've been trying to do with colleagues over a number of years is to make it more fine-grained. And I will give one example where I did that a few years ago with my colleague Marlene Miegelbauer. So what we did was a study of online comments. It was in a fairly complex activity type. So we looked at an Austrian news forum, an Austrian website, news website, where they showed a video of how British Parliament was discussing Brexit at the time, 2017, 2018. And there was the video that was running on the website. Then there was the journalist commenting on it. And then there were lots and lots of comments by users about what they saw happening in the video and about what the journalist said, and lots of interaction and amazingly rich data. And again, combining a lot of humor and emotion as well. And based on these data, we bottom up try to fine-tune what Martin and White had to say, what falls under their top level affect categories. This is already an adapted version of what we did back then. But you can see here certain emotions that we identified in our data and how we would categorize them to arrive at a more fine-grained idea of Martin's and White's affect categories. So you can see there is, for some of them, there's a certain negativity bias. So there was more insecurity than security, perhaps not surprisingly given the state of the discourse on Brexit at the time. Also more disinclination than inclination. So this was the forum of a rather left-leaning news outlet in Austria, so not fans of Brexit, but more equal in terms of polarity about happiness, unhappiness, satisfaction, and dissatisfaction. I would just here draw attention to the categories of amusement under satisfaction, pleasure, and Schadenfreude. So which sort of fade over into humor. Okay, so that's what the state we had about 5 years ago. And I've continued with people to work on emotion and social media comments since, and to develop also an affect taxonomy together with others, which I will present on the next slide, the current state of it. So this is very much ongoing research. So let's take this column by column because it's quite complex. So we can differentiate between 3 things: expressing emotion, authorial emotion by the first person. And it's really the author here in Goffman's terms. On social media comments, principal, author, animator, collapse. But in other genres, such as videos, for instance, that may be different people. So here it's about the author. They're expressing their emotion in the first person. And that can be done explicitly. So they overtly can say, I'm so angry. Or they can transfer that as an emotion triggering quality of something when something is called absolutely disgusting. That is what Bednarek calls covert emotion. And that can, of course, also happen visually through emojis depicting particular facial expressions. Then emotion can be ascribed to a third person. Again, that can be done explicitly. They were shocked overtly, or she was confronted with a shocking evidence. And we can see images of other people's facial expression, for instance. And finally, there's also the quality of discourse to afford emotion to a second person. So that means it has the potential to trigger or evoke an emotion in the audience. Mostly that is implicitly done, but it can be explicitly done. So we do have data such as you should be afraid of this development, or that must be a scary thought for you, covertly. It could potentially be done through memes and GIFs when it's made clear that it shows the emotional state that of the audience that could potentially be triggered. But all of this, expressing, ascribing, and affording, can also be done implicitly. It can be done through sound and music, which I'll not look at today. That's more relevant for video data. It can be done, I would argue, through impoliteness. So impoliteness is an implicit marker of anger. That perhaps includes sarcasm and ridicule. Could also be, and here we are back to evaluation, an implicit way of signaling anger could be the negative evaluation of a second person, as in you idiot, or the positive evaluation of a second person or self. There are data, especially in videos, again, where emotion can be implicitly expressed through silence. It can be done visually, so the vomit emoji, that would be implicit rather than explicit because it's a behavior that is based on an emotion. It's not a disgusted face, it's an action based on disgust. And then something that is ever present, especially in populist social media discourse, the clown face. So again, here we're looking at ridicule of somebody, you total clowns, or simply a string of clown emojis. Emotion can be implicitly ascribed, so not referring to some perceived feelings of a third person, but their behavior based on feelings like crying or tears. Could be images of the action of others. So that can be seen as being based on emotion. And affording emotion, so the potential to trigger emotion through discourse, as I said, that happens mostly implicitly. So here we're looking in political discourse online, we're, for instance, looking at rage bait. So describing actions by a third person that the discourse producer sees as negative and assumes their audience will also see as negative, and thereby triggering anger. That could be actions in the past, the present, or hypothetically in the future. Could also work the other way around. It could also be describing a positively perceived action by the first person to trigger admiration, for instance, or love or affection. So here we are looking at the ideological square, as Van Dijk formulated it. So highlighting what we think is positive about ourselves and what we think others may see as positive and therefore react emotionally, and foregrounding what we think is negative about a third person. And of course, that can also happen not by verbal description, but by visual depiction as well. So that's the framework as it stands at the moment. Let's now look at some data. So they are comments on posts by populist parties online. The first is from a study on social media comments, in this case on Instagram, by supporters of the short-lived but very successful Brexit party. That is a party that was founded in late 2018 by Nigel Farage, formerly of UKIP, now of Reform UK. And the Brexit party, in fact, became Reform UK once Brexit was completed. So I, in this case, looked at the Instagram account of that party around the European Parliament elections of 2019. So I looked at their posts in a 6-week span. It was 74, and I filtered that down because it was a manual study to look at posts that had at least 50 comments and 25 replies, or 25 comments and 50 replies. So that really led to, meaningful threads of a certain length. That left me with 8 original posts and the threads, and I looked at the threads, so the comments on the original posts. Of those original posts, 6 were against political opponents and 5 were in favor of the Brexit party. And it was a qualitative manual analysis of how certain social actors were discursively constructed, like the party, Remainers, the EU, etc. Unsurprisingly, when the original post was against a political opponent, there were much more negative emotion. There was much more negative emotion in the comments on the Instagram feed and few positive emotions. Vice versa, when the original post was in favor of the Brexit party, there was more positive emotion, love, excitement, pride, hope, but also quite a bit of negative emotion. So dislike, hate, sadness, anger, disgust, fear. And when I looked at the comments, it shows that it's not only supporters on this Brexit Party Instagram feed who are commenting, it's also opponents. And in the follow-up project that I'm doing as part of a team, we can actually see much more of that. So people deliberately going into social media feeds of parties they oppose in order to also post negative emotions. So here's one example of a Brexit Party post against an opponent. So these are EU politicians at the time. And this is a quote. "We finally turned them, Britain, into a colony, and that was our plan from the first moment." What this pull quote completely disregards is that that was said in a meeting by way of sarcasm to comment on what was perceived as some sort of paranoia by British people that the EU is against them. And actually, somebody points that out. Other people take it at face value and say, express in explicit ways dissatisfaction, specifically disgust. "They make me sick." They can do it simply visually, so with this face emoji, which expresses shock or disbelief. Of course, it's not always quite clear with facial expressions what emotion we are looking at, so it's often an approximation to analyze that. We have expressions of hate as a form of unhappiness. So Juncker, as he's actually called, and his unelected clan of odious narcissists. So they are odious, so that's a covert expression. The hate is becoming made into a quality of these people. They are worthy of hate. But they are also represented as hating the UK. So that's an ascribed emotion in an explicit way. But we also find positive emotion following from this. So given the state of the EU, vote for the Brexit Party, please. And a heart emoji, a symbol that explicitly expresses love or affection. Here's another one. So that was a later post that was after an incident where Nigel Farage gave a campaign speech for the EU elections and had a milkshake thrown at him. There are pictures what he looked like immediately afterwards. He was not smiling. But on the same day, the Brexit Party posted a smiling picture of him in a sort of careless gesture. And that triggered lots of emotional commentary as well. So partly disgust again. So the disgusting behavior of our enemy. So covert again, note the enemy here. But then also following on from that and beyond that incident, talking more generally about where can we see Farage speak? What are you going to that campaign rally? Somebody saying, "Yes, I can't wait." So here, implicit expression of excitement, satisfaction, but also of love through the cluster of emojis here. Second one is from the follow-on project, where we looked specifically at, we're still looking at social media comments on the social media feeds of populist parties, but we're also looking specifically at emotion now in the follow-on project. And we are looking not just as supporters, but also opponents. So who deliberately go onto these feeds to do negative evaluation and negative emotion very often. So this is in the Irish context, and I'm doing that with Laura Fiado. So here we're looking at social media comments by supporters and opponents of two parties in Ireland that can be seen as populist. So Sinn Féin as a left-wing populist party, which is in government, and a very small, fairly new party, the Irish Freedom Party, which started campaigning for Ireland leaving the EU, founded in 2018. So one of many very small right-wing populist parties in Ireland. There's quite a few of them, but with limited consequence for now. Again, we collected data around the parliamentary European Parliament elections, but the most recent ones in 2014. And we looked in this case not at Instagram, but at X. We looked at these two parties' posts. We looked at relevant posts. We found quite a few, and we whittled that down to 15 posts each. Again, those which had attracted a high number of comments. What you see here is the Sinn Féin logo. This is the logo of the Irish Freedom Party. So you have the Irish harp But then you have this element of the harp there that I've highlighted, which in the EU election campaign was transformed into something that I think was meant to look like the number 1, but it didn't go unnoticed that it looks very much like a symbol from 1930s fascist Italy. Good, so those are the two parties. Quick look, expressing emotion, both on the feeds of Sinn Féin and the Irish Freedom Party. So the stance of Sinn Féin is seen as boggles the mind. So this is an opponent. So an explicit, if covert, expression of disbelief. Freedom Party, Irish Freedom Party supporters hopefully say there will be more sovereignty and less diktat from Brussels. So an inclination for the future, hope. Lots of impoliteness here as well on both feeds, so which we can see as an implicit expression of anger. So fucking traitor, Sharia, Sinn Féin, or the Irish Freedom Party being called Nazi scum. And then we have humor again. So we have a repost, for instance, of a Sinn Féin original post together with verbal expression of laughter, or another repost or comment in this case for the Irish Freedom Party says the Freedom Party who offers no freedoms, 3 crying laugh emojis. So what do we have here? This is very common, but quite complex. So on the face of it, we could say, well, this is an implicit, this laughing is an implicit expression of amusement. So it's to do with satisfaction. But of course, that's not all of the pragmatic meaning. The pragmatic meaning is also about contempt. And we could see it as an expression of ridicule, as an impoliteness strategy. Emotions are ascribed, for instance, to a party. They are said to worry about something, but to be happy about something which then leads with contradiction. Note the metaphor here, swamp island with foreigners. It could be ascribed, the emotion, to the Irish people who are said to be proud of something, and Sinn Féin will guarantee to do them proud. But it can also be done visually. So this is a meme on the Sinn Féin post. So to say that Sinn Féin, again, does contradictory things. They are, in the view of their opponents, too friendly towards Islam, but they also stand in for trans rights, both of which are non-normative. IRA, so the former Irish Republican Army, of which Sinn Féin started as the political arm, is renamed as the Irish Refugee Association. So again, Sinn Féin allows too many refugees into the country. So perhaps the affordance here, the potential, these are things that are seen as negative by opponents and perhaps have the potential to trigger fear in the audience. On the Irish Freedom Party feed, anti-EU rhetoric, the metaphor here, EU is a Europe cancer that will destroy its people. So again, the metaphor having the potential to trigger fear. So after these two studies, we can further fine-tune the affect categories formulated by Martin and White. So the red ones are new. And of course, this is a very different discourse. And you can see that the emotions are much more intense. We don't just have regret now, we have hate. We have not just affection, we have love. We have disgust, shock, fear, worry, so very strong emotions. Of course, this is from a discourse that directly affects people. So it's not people just looking at, look what they are doing in Britain in Parliament, but this is our country, this is our election. This refers directly to us, which drives up the force of the emotion. As an outlook then, to conclude, more data analysis. So I'm also working with people on branding videos and have started working on anti-feminist videos on YouTube. So to inductively add to and further refine these affect subcategories, but also refine the taxonomy about how they are expressed. It lends itself to quantifying as affect subcategories and their expression in different genres and discourses. More dynamically looking at whether afforded emotions are evoked in interaction. And then one thing that I still would like to hear your thoughts on, what about the link between contestive humor and emotion? So we could see amusement as satisfaction, but is ridicule then an impoliteness strategy? And that would be classified as anger and dissatisfaction. So we end up with a contradiction. So I'm not quite sure how to deal with that yet. But on the whole, I think it's important to understand and also address emotions as both an individual and a collective motivation to endorse certain ideologies. And in different data sets that can be illiberal ideologies, but they can also be libertarian ideologies. If you're interested in that, I can elaborate on that. But for now, I thank you for your attention, and that's come to the end of my talk.